let's see. We'll start this first part of the meeting with the keywords, as we are getting into the habit of doing here. And then the second part of the meeting for today, we'll talk about the novel, just to get started on the novel. So that's our agenda. Before we do that, I wanted to just briefly touch on our sort of business side of the course. The midterm paper is due in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from today, so this is a reminder. As you probably know, we recognize it's the 4th of February is like 2 days after the Super Bowl, and probably everyone's going to be all jazzed up for that now that the Seahawks made it there. So just plan ahead. So if you're going to be a wreck for 2 days after that, or partying for 2 days after that, write your paper in advance. Okay. So there's that. If you want, we've already had a person from the Writing Center visit who let you know about opportunities for getting feedback from the Writing Center. So if you want that feedback, make plans to make an appointment or whatever with them. Or I've also offered to look at stuff or talk to you during my office hours about your papers as well, of course. So you can talk to me, and I hope that I can help you out if you would prefer my view of things. So that's that. And then don't forget the keywords are all posted on the Catalyst Share Space, so you can just go download those in advance and look at them if you like. They'll be helpful, as I talked about last time, for reviewing for the midterm, and then in thinking about your paper, you can also kind of use them as a point of departure, or you can criticize the keywords or something like that. That's always a good approach. And then, as I mentioned as well, I'm just making podcasts of the lectures if you want to review them or look at them, or that you don't have to, obviously. It just is one more resource for you if you miss class, for example, they are there. So that's on UW.Tegrity. I think it's .com, actually, and you'll just get a list of all the courses that you're registered for. We'll have to log in with your UW.Net ID, and then you can see Scan Crime Fiction 315 or JSIS 317, one of those two. The one thing I mentioned last time is that there's a little delay getting up to JSIS because I can only record it to one course, and then I have to copy it over to the other one. It takes a while for it to upload, and then it takes a while for it to get copied over there. So there's a delay if you're looking in the Jackson School course line if you're registered there. And then, of course, you can always email me about courses and stuff like course material and that kind of thing if you have any questions. So any stuff come up right now that people are wondering about or whatever? Okay, so we've done one novel. We're turning the corner now to The Water's Edge. And this is a novel maybe the most of all of ours that goes into this Scandinavian obsession with children. You see, it's a novel about the disappearance of a child, and then it gets kind of blown out from there, thematized more broadly. So it's an opportunity to talk about that. For Thursday, that'll be one of our keywords, the child, and you'll see by the end of the novel it does, the view of the child becomes more broad, a little more complicated, but I think that's there from the beginning as well. So we'll hold that off for next time. So we'll talk about the child specifically. For today, we want to talk about Norway to get started, and also sort of what the socially critical crime novel is. As I said the other day, if people know if the Scandinavian crime novel has like one reputation, it's sort of for this socially critical thing. So we can talk a little bit about that today and figure out a bit more about what that means. Let's start there. Okay, so let's start with Norway. I know, how many people here are studying Norwegian? Saw a couple people at the front. Okay, others in the back, maybe. Okay, great. So a few people who should be experts to some degree about, or know something more about Norway than the rest of us. Maybe I should know a little bit too, and I do. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about that for the first keyword. And again, this is not to sort of for each. I've chosen a novel from each of the countries in the Nordic region. Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden. So for each of those, we have a keyword, and the idea is that that'll give you some context for reading the novel, so it makes a little bit more sense. But second, that you come away from the course knowing a little bit more about that part of the world, since this is a course in the Scandinavian department. I think that's an important thing for you to learn in the course. So it's a chance not to just narrowly memorize some facts about Norway, but to try to get a sense of what that country's like and what are some of the issues there and so forth on the political agenda and in the popular culture and so forth. So let's just start there I'll start with an invitation for you to tell me what you know about Norway. Yeah.
They have a lot of oil.
Oil, very good. A lot of oil, yeah. James.
Nobel Peace Prize.
Nobel Peace Prize, okay. Cameron.
Progressive penal system.
Progressive penal system. So here's one where we actually get close to you'll see in the novel here that there is discussion of imprisonment and incarceration. It's quite different than what we think about. It's interesting to think about why systems have those, penal systems differ so greatly. It's quite a different one. But the Scandinavian ones they're not that different one from the next. Yeah.
Northern Lights.
Okay, Northern Lights, very good. So all these actually, except for maybe Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Finland, they all have big expanses of territory in the far, far north, largely uninhabited. I mean, there's towns and small cities, but huge expanses of uninhabited areas. And Norway is a very mountainous country. It's worth noting as well. And so it's just lots of space, and people are often go into these spaces, and then the Northern Lights and the various sorts of wonders of nature up there. Norway, if you've ever who's seen a poster picture of Norway? Maybe everyone has seen a little picture somewhere. I'm just going to ask, think just super quick, what did you see what was in the picture? Fjords. What else? Mountains, snow. Right, this is how Norway markets itself as a sort of untrammeled, beautiful nature with like spectacular, sublime landscapes, right, with these striking fjords and huge rock faces and amazing opportunities to get out in nature. That's a very strong part of its sort of image for people around the world who go to Norway as tourists. So this is when the country markets itself, it markets itself in that way, that sort of the natural image, Norway's natural beauty. Northern Lights, not Northern Denmark. Okay, what was your name again?
Jennifer.
Jennifer, thank you. Other things here. Yeah, Austin.
Lots of political parties.
Lots of political parties. Very good observation. Why is that? Helpful.
They combine political parties with different positions.
Right. So, I mean, it's a parliamentary system, okay? And a parliamentary system, parties get into the equivalent of our Congress. That is both, there's usually a unicameral Congress. Well, in all these countries, there's a unicameral organization, right? So there's not this bicameral thing where we have a House and a Senate, which is a way of kind of trying to split the difference between upper class control and popular control. They have popular control, basically, which means there's only a parliament. And to get into parliament, you vote. When you vote in a parliamentary election, you don't vote for a person. Or wait, you vote for a person and then that vote also counts as a party vote. So let's say I vote for so and so from the the Labour Party in Norway, which is the kind of center-left party, basically equivalent to the Democratic Party in the United States. Then that person gets a vote, and the party also gets a vote. So what they do is then they sum up how many votes the party gets, and based on that number, they get a certain number of seats in Parliament, and then they also count the votes of each person who's running for the Parliament, and those people then are put in a list, everyone in the party in the top, say, 15 or 20 or however many seats they get in the Parliament, get into Parliament as representatives of that party. So it's both the popularity of the party and the popularity of the people, the MPs who are running for office, parliamentary office, who get into the parliament. Does that people understand that? Yeah, right. A lot of people from political science and law, society, and justice, and so forth. You know these things, and others. It's not that complicated, right? But that's the reason there's lots of political parties, because a small party can get into the parliament if they get like I think the minimum is 6% of the vote. So you get these very small parties that actually have a presence, and then they can be very important in building a coalition that then becomes the ruling coalition, right? Because you put together 3 or 4 parties, say, to run the country, and then the biggest party of those 3 or 4 has a prime minister. But now, for the first time in a very, very long time, the right wing has won in Norway. It's been the Labour Party that's been in control for decades, but now the right, with some small interruptions, but the right wing party it's called Venstre in Norway in Norwegian is in control now. So it's a big change from the past. There's also a very strong, we can talk about as we go through there, very strong sort of anti-immigrant party called the Progress Party, and they're more moderate than the anti-immigrant party in Denmark, which is the most sort of radical or right wing, but these parties are sort of interesting because they usually have left wing politics. They're sort of populist. They say we want to protect the benefits that everyone has. They're not trying to cut, but they say those benefits should only be for certain kinds of people, right? Which basically a race thing in different language for the ethnic Norwegians, right? And so there's this kind of what people you can call dog whistle politics, where all these things going on in the culture that are a way of signaling who should get what and who's more important and so forth. And so among those parties, there's a broad spectrum from left to right. I don't know if Norway still has a communist party, but all the Nordic countries had pretty strong communist parties throughout the post-war period. But after the Cold War, they've diminished in significance. So they're sort of main center-left parties, like the Labour Party in Norway, that remain important. So, lots of political parties, broad political spectrum, and politically very far to the left of the United States. Even the Democratic Party would be on the pretty far right wing obviously the anti-immigrant stuff is not a part of the Democratic Party platform necessarily. I guess there's parts of it that might resonate, but still pretty far to the left of the American political spectrum. Yeah, other points. Kaya, thank you.
Part of the European Union.
What's that? Outside?
Yes.
Outside the EU, right. So outside the EU, another point there. We'll just pile them up here, and then we'll talk about some more. Yeah, name?
Hannah.
Hannah.
Welfare state.
Okay, welfare state, very good. So these are political parties outside the EU, welfare state. They all kind of go together. Yeah. Known for its skiing, very good. We got the Winter Olympics coming up. Norway has like 4.5 million people, and they always get all these medals in the Winter Olympics because they win all these medals in cross country skiing and alpine skiing and so forth. So you can tie it together from the oil to the skiing, right? They have all that money they can plug into these sports programs and sports that they're not global sports really, and so as a result they get these. Thanks, Ben.
Lakes and forests.
Okay, lakes and forests. Maybe lakes and forests for sure. Mountains more so. That's the big one for Norway. And the fjord, someone already said too at the very beginning. So we'll put that on there too. But yeah, nature for sure. Yeah. We got the Northern Lights. We'll put Midnight Sun up there. So we see nature coming up big here for Norway. Notions in Norway. Yeah, name? Ken? Yeah.
I think they have polar bears.
No polar bears. But yeah, big polar. I think maybe I don't think that. No, I think aren't polar bears only in? I don't think they do. Greenland maybe. It's always the famous. It's like the famous joke over there. Many people. There's lots of American exchange students going there to Norway, Sweden, Finland, whatever. And the locals always say, "Oh, so-and-so showed up and they thought there were going to be polar bears on the street," right? Because it's, But I actually lived in Finland as an exchange student, and in the spring I was riding my bike to school, and there was a moose right on the street. So, maybe the cliche is true. Other stuff. Yeah.
Fishing culture.
Okay, fishing. Yeah, very good. Yeah. Oslo's a capital. Very good. I'll try to get lots of different people here. Yeah.
They have many dialects.
Dialects. Very good. Yeah. That's actually, this is one thing I'll just mention. This is an important one to mention here. Dialects. There's two Norwegians. So-called book Norwegian. And then New Norwegian. And I'm just going to tell you in a second here what's going on with these two, because this tells you something about the country. Norway was a part of Denmark after the Viking Age, basically. So, or well, a little bit later than that. So from, it was I think 1255 until 1809, Norway was a part of Denmark, and it was basically a province or even colony of Denmark. And that meant that when the written language of Norwegian administration was Danish. And so coming from that history, book Norwegian is basically like written Danish with very few differences. There's pronounced completely differently. It's like a very strong English accent and a Middle Western American accent. They're that far apart. Like if you've ever seen a film from, say, Scotland or the northern part of the UK, you can't, like Trainspotting. Has anyone seen Trainspotting? You can't understand the characters without subtitles. Right? It's that far a difference almost. I mean, if you get used to it, you can understand it fairly easily. But same language, but strong differences in dialect. That's how far apart Danish and Norwegian are, even though book Norwegian and Danish are written the same. So in the 19th century, that's often thought of the century of the nation, where various nations that came from these big empires of the past, the Russian Empire, the English Empire, the British Empire, the Great French Empire, whatever, as these parts of that had been smaller countries, had been parts of these larger countries, tried to establish themselves as nations. Finland, for example, Norway. One of the ways they tried to do that was by saying, this is our language, we need to be proud of it. And oftentimes these languages weren't even written languages, because German was the language or Swedish was the language. There was another language that was the main language. And the thing that everyone spoke was one thing, but the written language was another one. In Norway, book Norwegian was the written language. For example, the Bible is written in book Norwegian, but there's all these dialects and these hills and dales and valleys and so forth. And Norwegian patriots said, we shouldn't have Danish, we should have our own Norwegian language. And so they came up with a system by sort of knitting together all these different dialects called New Norwegian. And so New Norwegian pulls all these dialects together and draws from older forms of Norwegian to create a written language that is also a national language. So Norwegian has two official languages, New Norwegian and Book Norwegian. And you can write either one in official settings, and it's about 60-40. 60% of people write in that Book Norwegian, about 40% of people write in New Norwegian. And people speak the dialects anyway, so it's not that big a difference in terms of spoken language, but people make a choice then about what language they're going to write, and then different universities have different emphases in terms of how many people are there. So this is something to know about Norway. It tells you about how it's national pride, and also about all these dialects out in the sticks, so to speak. Our novel takes place very close to Oslo. It's kind of like a border within an hour of Oslo in southeastern Norway. So we're kind of in the capital city area, not out that far. But it's very easy to get out much farther in Norway, where these dialects are small and quite strong, and people recognize where they come from in the country. But scores of dialects. So yeah, very good point. Other things that come to mind, Gabrielle?
Is yogurt a big thing there?
Is yogurt a big thing there? Well, Norway has a lot of dairy farming, and so yogurt is like you buy it in a carton and there's lots of it. I don't think there's a particular Norwegian culture of yogurt. You may be thinking of Iceland because there's like an Icelandic yogurt that's getting marketed, in, at least in the stores I go to in Seattle, which is kind of a funny thing because Icelandic yogurt is not good. The Icelanders will tell you, or it's sort of it goes back to this old fermented milk called sur, which is like sour milk basically, SYR. And it's, you know, they used it. They would make it to preserve milk because Iceland has this horrible climate, and that was a way of preserving things. So there, if you read the sagas, you can find out things about it. But now they've reinvented it and are marketing. It's kind of like Greek yogurt, you know, where it's a brand now. But yeah, other things. Yeah, Cameron.
Black metal and church burns. Okay,
black metal and church burns. Very good. So yeah, I don't. There was these, Norway has like a big death metal, black metal subculture for some reason. And there was like these spectacular events that were heavily covered in the tabloids in the 90s, where I think there was some murders and they burned some churches from 1,000-year-old churches or something like that, maybe one or two of them. It's that, people glommed onto that very quickly, and it's kind of this thing where it's part of the youth culture. So you may encounter it. There's a lot of people actually that study, maybe, I know that for sure in Finnish too we have this, where people study the language because they know the music, and so the popular music brings people in. Yeah?
Well, growing up here, there was a great dislike between the Norwegians and the Swedes.
Okay, so Norwegian v. Swedish animus. Why is that? Anyone know? Go ahead.
Sweden used to rule Norway, and then during World War II, then Norway was occupied, and Sweden let the Germans, pass materials through.
Right. So there's many. The main reason is historical. If you go over to Ballard and you see there's some sort of tension between the Norwegian ethnic identifiers and Swedish ethnic identifiers, it's the 19th century that made it that way. Because Norway had been for a long time part of Denmark, then it became part of Sweden through the Napoleonic Wars, and actually at the same time Norway got its own constitution, so it had a lot of autonomy, but it was still like Sweden that ran the show, or had the final decision on many matters. And that's just like, it's a hard one to swallow for a lot of people. It's this sort of independent Norwegian farmers out there who don't want to be told what to do, and so it's just that kind of history. To put it in in a general way, right? So, Norwegian, Swedish animus. There's all kinds of humor that goes around this. So we're filling out a picture pretty well here. One thing that hasn't come up that is worth mentioning as well, that's in the keyword, is Anders Behring Breivik. Who's he? If we just mention him, the Norwegians don't mention his name, but Cameron?
He was responsible for the Oslo massacre in 2011, I believe.
Right, exactly. 722, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken. Right, so you may know, this tells us a little bit about contemporary Norway, too, and actually it's sort of an interesting one for the crime novel as well. So, 722, it's kind of like a 9/11 date in Norwegian public culture. So there was these attacks, a bomb went off in the downtown next to the Parliament building. It killed, I think, was it 6 people maybe in this downtown area, like a Timothy McVeigh thing, like Oklahoma City, where someone put a big bomb in front of a government building. And then, much more horrifying, that same afternoon, in the kind of chaos following the initial bombing, an heavily armed man attacked a youth political camp of this Labour Party, so the left-wing coalition, and he killed 64 people with heavy arms over the course of 2 hours. On this island called Utøya, which is just outside, just in the vicinity of Oslo, and then was arrested by police and laid down his weapons. And so it was this guy, Anders Behring Breivik, who then before he had made this attack, he published all these things online, this long manifesto about why he was doing what he was doing, and basically it was a race war. He was trying to initiate a race war. He claimed that Norway was being, invaded by others in Norway for Norwegians, and that he was going to make this symbolic stand against those changes. So the response by mainstream Norwegian society was complete rejection. They don't say the name there in all the coverage. They tried to deny him and his political stance any kind of attention. At the same time as they prosecuted him and put him in prison now, which comes back to the penal system, is that no life sentence. He's in prison, I think, for 25 years with the opportunity for renewal of the sentence. But he's not like they didn't throw away the key or give him the death penalty, because neither of those options are available in the Norwegian legal system. But this was a very big moment both in Scandinavia and Norway, Europe on the whole, because it was such a spectacular attack in the name of a anti-immigrant political stance. So Breivik is an important name to know, just because it tells you something about what's going on in Norway at the time. Or recently, the thing is to mention as well is that the really horrifying thing about it is that this camp that he attacked was like a very beloved place for it's like a youth camp for 16 to 22-year-olds involved in this political party. So for people who are politically active and want to go forward in this party in Norwegian politics, and he killed many people of ethnic background or like non-Norwegian background. That just means that I use that term only because their families may have lived there for 50 years, but it's just like in the United States where we identify that a person of Chilean background or whatever, even though you're of course an American citizen. So it was a very sad moment, and terrorist attack by a citizen on his own country, his own sort of members of his own country, fellow citizens. So that's another thing to mention here. Immigration is not really a theme. It pops up kind of in the background here once or twice, but it's not a main theme in our novel for this time. Actually, Fossum, if you like her or don't like her, I'll just mention it. She has written a novel that's a lot more overtly about immigration called Don't Look Back in the UK translation, and I think The Indian Bride in the American title. And it's quite an interesting novel in a lot of ways. I've read a lot of different novels of hers for the Norwegian one, and that is a interesting one. Okay, so that a little bit of background for Norway. The one thing to emphasize here is that I wanted to look at my notes here. One thing that we should just take a second more to talk about before we turn to the socially critical crime novel is the idea of the welfare state that came up, and I think it's important for understanding some of these themes around the child, and this idea of equality and solidarity. And let's just take a second to think about those words, and I would like you to talk to someone sitting next to you, and if you put those together, equality and solidarity, what's one thing you would expect from a society or a state that emphasizes equality and solidarity? Okay, so just come up with an answer to that question. We'll try to put your answers into conversation with Norway. So let's take about a minute or two to do that, then we'll turn to the class. Equality and solidarity, what are the consequences for a society?
Yes, if you're getting taxed.
Everybody's paying more.
But that's the thing, they know they're getting more. Remember, they're talking about Greece. They're going, oh, we don't want to help Greece because we don't know if we'll get it back. Exactly. He says you have to take care of him. Just book it. It's like, I don't know, 5 years to leave.
Well, the negative, I think, you know, when you're Scandinavian,
Okay, so question was equality and solidarity. What do you get when you put an emphasis on these things in a society or in a state, right? Yeah, Cassie. Okay. Good. So together, so unity equals equity of resources and access. So super heavy emphasis on having the same things or having access to the same things. Austin.
Kind of building on that, I know they have free healthcare, free college, and then really high taxes,
Etc. paid for with high taxes. Actually, it's interesting when you mentioned that that it is free healthcare, and so one I always mention that I think is pretty amazing to Americans is the child benefit. Maybe people know about child benefits, but these aren't means tested. When we say welfare in the States, we often mean means tested systems where you qualify for welfare by meeting a certain minimum standard. So if you're below that standard, then you qualify for some kind of benefit. In order to get food stamps, your income has to be below a certain level, right? And then you're eligible for a certain package of food stamps paid on a monthly basis. But these are universal benefits. And the one I always mention is the child benefit, where when a child is born, until the kid turns 18, the mother gets about $100 to $150 payment for that kid to help provide for the needs the child might have, right? Whether that's books that you have to pay for in high school, they pay for their books there rather than getting them from the school, or diapers when they're little or whatever. But just think about that. Why would you make a payment like that? Why would a state make a payment like that? Right. Yeah. Yeah, Leah, sorry. Right, I mean, it's like a notion of that a child needs a certain basket of things in order to thrive, and if the state has an interest in those kids thriving, and so they invest in the front end to make sure the kid has adequate resources. So it's interesting too, right, that it's paid to the mother, or now direct deposit in the mother's account, right? Because there's these things. It's always like, don't let the guy get it because he'll drink it. Like when you do it at the societal level, I guess you'd have to take those things into consideration. I know none of you would do that, but so yeah. But this is the thinking that there's a certain minimal amount of resources that you need in order to kind of thrive in the society. So yeah, but healthcare, all kinds of benefits like that that are part of the system. And that's the idea of solidarity, that people have to pay out in order to make that happen for everyone. And so, and of course, the idea of progressive taxation is that if you have enormous amount of resources, it's not as big a hit for you on like what you need to do to provide for yourself to take a bigger chunk of taxes from someone who's got gazillions than from someone who's got, say, 20,000 a year or whatever like that. So this is the idea. This is an important idea. Now, what's the downside of that? Austin mentioned high taxes. Other things, like high taxes, if you ever get a chance to go to Norway, go have a coffee or go have a beer in some cafe and just look at the price. Anyone want to guess what it is? It's like $8 for a coffee, $10 for a coffee, like for your short latte or whatever. $15 for a beer, I think it is now. I haven't been in Norway for a while, but you're just like, what? How can it be that? But part of it is taxes. And the other thing is that notion of solidarity, very strong unions, right? 90% unionization rate. Compared to the United States, where it's like 8 now, right? And so they bargain for good wages. So it's if the barista's making $20 an hour, you can't be slinging $2 donuts or $2 coffees, right? Just like because you're paying for the person to be there behind the counter. And you can think about that's where we're, obviously Seattle and SeaTac have been in the news because of these minimum wage policies that people have passed. But that's something to think about is, what do people want to pay for? So there they made that choice, and that's a part of the system. Other downsides? Anyone? Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that makes this work is that everybody's perceived to be kind of having the same values, and there are not a lot of free riders in the system.
Mm-hmm.
But once the homogeneity starts to be threatened,
Yeah.
trust goes down, and all of a sudden the willingness to pay.
So that's the question, right? Is we have this is a big part of the immigration debate. Is those people are different. Do they have the same values as we do? This is like the mainstream talking to itself, right? And then you have these kinds of debates that begin to there's some sort of fragmenting of at least people's perceptions of what's going on, and this is often then a fault line for conflict. Of course, there's all these, the same things are there, historically, the alcoholics or whatever, people who are free riders in the same way, who they don't want to or can't participate in the society, and as a result, they're not sort of paying in, so to speak. So they're old conflicts in a way, but I think race then figures in them in a new way here. So these are some issues that help us think. So we're going to pick this up when we come to the child, right? Because it's super, I think one of the reasons that the child is keeps coming back in these novels is it's kind of like the canary in the coal mine. The child is the canary in the coal mine, where you really test the values of society and see what matters and how people are thinking about things. So I'm just going to tell you one thing about the novel to make that connection. The novel is kind of innocuously titled in English, or weirdly titled, The Water's Edge. But I noticed, this is the one with these Scandinavian novels, they always retitle them. I just was checking this out, and the title in Norwegian is Someone Who Loves Something. So you can think about that as you're reading, someone who loves something. What's the difference? We'll take up this question later, but someone who loves something, or the one who loves something. What does that have to do with this novel? Oftentimes, a novel's title is often the most important words in the novel in a way. But, if you think about it in the kind of context that we're talking about, solidarity, equality, what matters, how does the thing you love change your place in the society? So, we'll come back to that. Let's turn now. We've had some time on Norway, their socially critical crime novel. Let's start by, I want to ask you, just again, talking to people sitting next to you, what do you do when you criticize? We all love to do it, right? Come on. What do you do? Let's just take a minute to talk and come up with something to tell the class. What do you do when you criticize?
When you criticize, tell them about it. There's no easy way. You just come out and say it, man. It's bad. It's bad. It's a criticism for a reason.
Because again, like saying,
sometimes it's just like, it's like truth, bro. Like, you read a paper, you're just like, yo, you're probably gonna have to do some shit, dude. Like, why is it so bad? You do it.
Okay, so the question was, what do you do when you criticize? So just hit it, Gabrielle. Focus on the negative. We often associate criticism with the negative. Yeah, Christine.
So you pick something you don't like, and then you have to support it. So there's always a because. And
Okay.
There are counterexamples or some other reasoning system.
Okay, so that you focus on something that you said you don't like, but then there's a because, and there's an obligation to explain in criticizing what it is you don't like. So there's both identification and explanation. Cassie.
You're just trying to be
I'm sorry, Casey, right? Sorry.
You're just trying to be fair and objective. Like, you're not really trying to be like, oh, this is great, but you're not, trying to really pick out all the negatives. You're just really trying to see,
Okay, so there's a notion of like dispassionate kind of talking where instead of getting really worked up and using emotion to do the explanation, there's a kind of a pointing out of this thing that's an issue, but then you're explaining in a more objective way rather than kind of getting all worked up. So that's another dimension there. Agnes.
And adding on to the comment, I think also providing an alternative perspective.
Okay. Alternative perspective. I should be writing these things down. So we have perspective. I'll put because. That's Christine's point. Gabrielle, did you have kind of fault finding?
Yeah.
Fault finding. We'll say that's maybe a important one. I know when people criticize me, it's always fault finding, right? So, I'm going to circle the wagons. No, I don't do that. Kaya.
Identifying the flaws, but not always offering solutions.
Okay, so not always, you just say? Offer solutions. Okay, so criticism can also be, or we always, there's this idea that criticism entails kind of an ethical responsibility. If you're going to find fault, you're supposed to tell people how you would fix it, right? So this is good. It emphasizes what we kind of expect from the critic. Yeah. Okay, that was going to say. Okay, Jake.
Criticisms are usually based on your own opinion.
Okay. Notion of opinion is present in the criticism, so that there's a perspective, maybe a strong perspective. There's different ideas about criticism, because Casey said, emphasize objectivity, where you're emphasizing sort of the subjective, right? Opinion is something that I hold, whereas objective, how do you be objective in it when you criticize, right? You subscribe to some rules about how things should be. So, for example, in literary criticism, right, there's a whole history of aesthetics in the way that we talk about literature, and so it's not just like, I hated it, it sucked, right, but that you talk about, in the 18th century, Dryden said a good poem, or what did Virgil say, should delight and instruct, right? So that then you point out how it delights, but then also how it instructs, right? So you're participating in a longer conversation. So we'd say tradition, which is kind of building off the idea of the objective, versus taste, which is also an important part of criticism about particular subjective opinion. Oftentimes, right, we like good critics. A good critic, right, has taste. They have a subjective opinion. That's one of the reasons we read them or watch them sometimes. This is moving more toward like cultural criticism or some kind of criticism in the public culture. Catherine? Jennifer, sorry.
It's okay. That was what I was going to say, actually, that there are different styles of critiquing. One based on, like, your own set ideals, or you're basing it off of, like, a general consensualized agreement, like what society has about what a crime novel should have.
Okay, good. So you're in a way you've kind of systematized what, or put into better language what I was saying about Casey and Jake's point, that there's a sort of this subjective versus objective, different styles that kind of go in different ways. So one of the things, these are great points here, and when we think about criticizing, one of the things we want to think about is, well, how does a novel be socially critical? I think these are some of the things that it does. These are some of the things these novels do in order to be socially critical. One of the things is that I think I want to say don't put too much stock in fault finding, because there is that does go on, but in another way it's trying to start a conversation. Criticism, you can see, is like an attempt at conversation, a dialogue, right? When you say, for example, that such and such a book is a good book, that because that Christine mentioned is really important. Well, why? Why do you think it's a good book? You want to hear more about what the person says or what that critical perspective is. And when you do that, then you're asking a question. Well, why do you think that? And then that initiates a dialogue. And oftentimes these novels, when they're socially critical, what they're trying to do is initiate a dialogue, right? Rather than present some kind of like list of flaws and problems that need to be dealt with. And so the question can be then, well, how do you start that dialogue? How do you get people involved in that conversation? And that's one of the things that we ask. I think that's a good question to ask in looking at these novels. Where are they putting the emphasis? What are they trying to do to get us to talk about them? Right? Maybe that's one of the reasons the child keeps coming back. It kind of pushes people's buttons. Right? People get, upset about children suffering harm. So these are some of the things, that idea of conversation, and I think this moving back and forth between subjective and objective are very important as well. The other thing that we should keep in mind is, as I pointed out, right, this Sjöwall, remember the history of the Scandinavian crime novel? They were big social critics, and so it's also a tradition in Scandinavia that this is how it's done. One problem is, like, if you look at a novel like this, you could ask yourself, is this a socially critical crime novel? Fossum's maybe more toward the less socially critical of the novels we'll read. You get Dragon Tattoo, right? If people have read it or you're going to read it. Just notice the epigraphs. You know what an epigraph is? It's these like little quotations that begin the chapter sections. And I think the first one is like, 65% of Swedish women have been abused or threatened with harm. You know, I mean, the theme is pretty clear, right? This is about violence against women. That's social criticism, right? And it's pretty overt. This is a little more subtle, perhaps. Too subtle, maybe not socially critical at all. But we can talk about that. So what I'm trying to say is that there's these things we can look for. What kind of conversations is the novel trying to start? And number two, we can say because we know it's part of the tradition in Scandinavia, we should keep our eye out for it. And so one of the takeaways from this class, if you remember a few things, is that the socially critical crime novel is the main form. And it's usually a police procedural. So one of the questions for the midterm and one of the questions for the final paper is, how does it do with social criticism? You know, how is it doing that? How is it trying to start that conversation? How can we engage with it in dialogue? And there's different ways to think about that we'll talk about in the second half of the period. Did you have a point, Gabrielle?
I guess. So then, when you talk about socially critical crime novels as like a term, do you mean it in the sense that it's like the novel is trying to criticize things about society?
That's what I mean. That's exactly what I mean. The novel is trying to criticize things about society, and in doing that, it's doing a couple different things. It's trying to, one, I think it's true, to do a little bit of fault finding, to call our attention to things that we wouldn't notice otherwise. For example, right, we talked about last time gender, sexuality in the later line of novel. Right, she's trying to raise those up to make people pay more attention to them than they might otherwise pay attention. But it's also trying to start a dialogue about those to make that dialogue a part of the culture. But criticizing society, criticizing attitudes. Well, how do you criticize society? Sounds like something, you know, some burnouts would say, right? I'm going to criticize society, man. Right? What exactly is it? So the point is try to think a little bit more sophisticatedly about what does that mean and how are the novels doing that. So it's kind of an open question that we can keep thinking about as the course goes on. Dismissed it for 10 minutes.